Welcome back with a smiling face. Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. Echoes of Shattered Destiny. Episode 26. I didn't have to be linked to Zeke to feel his hurt. Even if he did hide it perfectly, it was there just beneath the surface, bubbling and festering away like an open wound. Things between Maddox and I weren't always perfect, and I knew from experience how badly it could hurt to be cast aside by your mate. Zeke didn't dignify her with a response. He shook his head ruefully and left the room. When he emerged into the observation room, he made a beeline for the door and left without a word. The urge to storm in there and smack out of her was strong, so strong that I had to take a few deep breaths to keep calm. Zeke interviewed Tessa. He just left, so you might run into him. I mind-linked Maddox, giving him a heads up before he found out some other way. Maddox's disappointment trickled down the bond, mixed with his concern for Zeke. She didn't tell him anything, did she? No, she didn't. She actually said that she'd prefer torture over having to talk to him. I scoffed, glaring at the witch through the double-paned glass. If you're going to stand there and glare at me, you might as well come inside and do it to my face. Tessa called out, her voice crackling through the speakers mounted in the corners of the room. Who knows, maybe I'll tell you a secret or two. You wouldn't imagine the information I've got locked in my head. I had almost given in to her obvious goading, seconds away from storming in there to defend Zeke. Even with her egging me on by holding what she knew over my head, the way she phrased it made me pause. It was the inspiration for a plan, one that required someone specific for it to work. Hey, Maddox! You're on your way here, right? I called out, tapping my foot impatiently. Tessa continued to talk, but I easily tuned her out. She wasn't as vicious and condescending as her twin. Her attempts to piss me off were mediocre and half-hearted at best. Yeah, I'm a couple minutes out. Did you need me to bring anything? He replied. Actually, I do. Pick up Zeke and Rowena and bring them here. I've got a plan. I'm sorry, you want me to what? Rowena questioned, her eyebrows lifting. She smoothed out the flowy dress she wore and lowered herself into one of the metal chairs in the observation room. Zeke sat to her left, his face carved into a permanent scowl. I want to know if it's possible for you to use your magic to get into Tessa's head. I repeated. You're a natural, so your magic comes from all things living and organic, right? In theory, it should be possible. Well, you're right about that. It should be, but I won't know for sure without seeing the witch first. I need to know how powerful she is mentally. Rowena replied. I glanced over at Maddox, who nodded in silent agreement. Follow me, I said, gesturing to the cell door. The four of us entered Tessa's small cell, circling the cot she now sat on. For good measure, Maddox bound her wrists and secured them to the bar bolted onto the wall. It was just a precaution considering Rowena would have to touch her to work her magic. Tessa didn't seem like the volatile type, but we couldn't risk her trying to physically attack one of us. Rowena's eyes became unfocused as she stood over Tessa, three of her fingers pressed against the younger witch's forehead. Her lips were pursed with concentration as the tingle of magic filled the air. A few minutes passed when she stood and straightened her spine. So, I can slip into her mind, she stated, but the way she trailed off made it seem as though she was leaving something out. Apparently, I wasn't the only one that felt that way. Why does it feel like there should be a but at the end of that? Zeke grunted, keeping his eyes anywhere other than Tessa's face. It's not going to be easy. She's strong not only physically, but mentally. I'm going to need Lola to use her magic to subdue her and make her compliant. It will be daunting considering you not only need to subdue her physical body, but her mind too. Rowena explained, wincing as swiveled her head to Zeke. I'm not going to lie, it's going to be risky for you. Since she's your mate and there's a connection between you two, there's a chance that by rummaging around in her head, I end up harming yours. Simply put, the worst case scenario is that I fry your mind. Well, shit. My stomach dropped to the floor between my feet. Tessa's entire face paled, right down to her slender neck. Her body tensed to the point where I could see her tendons straining against her skin. As nice as it would have been to assume she was nervous for Zeke's sake, I doubted it. She was probably only worried about her own mind, not her soulmate's. Absolutely not. Maddox spoke up first. We'll have to find another way. It's not worth the risk. Agreed. It chimed in. I'm sorry, I wish I could do more. Rowena said solemnly. It took me a moment to realize Zeke hadn't said anything. He was looking down at Tessa with a mixture of emotions, so many that I couldn't even begin to untangle them all. They dripped from the sharp points of his frown, pouring from eyes just a few shades lighter than Maddox's. Without looking away he said, "You have my permission to do it." "Zeke, don't," Maddox said, his voice full of dismay. The way Zeke turned away from Tessa to look at Rowena was almost mechanical. My chest throbbed with grief for my friend, and for the happiness I could see withering away inside of him. I put my hand on his shoulder, but he barely seemed to notice. "Nothing is worth risking your mind. We will find another way to stop them. Enough, both of you. This is about more than my mind. I've made my decision, and as a fellow Alpha and Luna, I expect you both to respect it." Zeke said coldly, his shoulder rigid beneath my hand. He stared Rowena down and asked, "When can you begin?" "I'll need a few days to gather supplies and build my strength. I suggest Lola do the same." She stammered, her cheeks flushed, and eyes widened with surprise. Rowena was first to leave, fluttering from the room with her dress billowing out behind her. Zeke followed, his posture rigid and mechanical. His expression was a mask, blank and full of harsh unforgiving angles. It reminded me of how Maddox looked when we'd first met. "Go talk to him," I told Maddox, then slid me eyes to Tessa and held them there. "I'll catch up." Maddox didn't argue as he left the cell and followed after Zeke, but he did make a show of reminding me we needed Tessa alive. Once the door clicked shut behind me, Tessa pursed her lips and let out a withering snort. "He'd really risk his mind shattering for you." Disgust flooded me in vicious waves that turned my blood to lead. I curled my lip at her, hating how she spoke like she knew anything about Zeke or what he stood for. Zeke is an alpha. He has an entire pack to look after. That means families with children and elderly, people just trying to live their lives. They rely on him to keep them safe. They trust him. Everything he does is for them, and for the vampires we want to coexist with," I said sharply, letting rage fill my voice with venom. Tessa went silent, and I took that as my cue to leave. As I turned away, she spoke. "This perfect future of yours doesn't have room with witches. We've had to fight for our place in this world, and we'll continue to fight." Every limb, every muscle in my body went stiff. It took restraint I didn't know I had not to turn around and yell in her face. Perhaps the past version of myself would. She'd let her emotions overwhelm her instead of using them to her advantage, and any point she tried to make would fail before it even had a chance. Well, not this time. I looked her up and down, starting with the rat's nest that was her rich, brown hair. It was the same color as tree bark, while her eyes mirrored the moss that would climb its roots. Her cloak was tattered, torn in certain places, and covered in a mixture of dirt and blood. The same dirt coated her cheeks and forehead. At first glance, she wasn't much, but I saw what others did not. Not once did she shy away from my stare. No, she returned it with one of her own. She did not submit. "You're the mate of an alpha. Do you understand what that means?" I asked, but didn't wait for an answer. "It means you were born to be a Luna. You're destined to rule over an entire pack of werewolves, and you're telling me a future of peace doesn't include witches." I opened the cell door and gave her one last look, one I hoped conveyed every ounce of my disappointment in her. "You're fighting the right battle, Tessa. You're just on the wrong side of it." Not only did I avoid visiting Tessa for the next 3 days, but I also made it a point not to think of her or what she knew. I stumbled back into my routine even though everything felt off-kilter. Chris made warrior training worth it, but my heart was no longer invested in my magical studies. There was only one thing I was fixated on, and that was dark magic. The one and only time I used it was almost enough for it to corrupt me. There was nothing more terrifying than feeling the sickening euphoria of ultimate power, and ultimate evil. I wanted to learn everything I could so I could make sure it never happened again. There was just one problem. Since only a handful of witches successfully pulled from that kind of power, there wasn't exactly any information on it. There were a few vague descriptions, but nothing going into detail on how or why those witches did what they did. I voiced my frustration to Maddox every spare chance I had, along with the absolute terror I felt when I looked down to see spider webs of sickening black crawling up my fingers. Maddox hadn't blamed me for drawing on dark magic. He wasn't even angry. There was a part of me that wanted him to be. I'd been reckless, desperate to not be taken that I wasn't thinking clearly. We knew too little about my magic for me to not exercise extreme caution when using it. Maddox knew this, but he still insisted on being utterly perfect by not reaming into me every chance he had. He was a master at covering up his emotions, but I could feel his fear flicker down the mate bond like it were my own. He might not have been angry with me for using dark magic, but he was just as freaked out over how close it had come to consuming me. The first and second day, Maddox sent out a few groups of warriors to monitor the safe haven. He and Zeke, along with a dozen of our most skilled fighters, made the short trip to Zeke's pack. It was more of a precaution than anything else, but with Zeke dead set on risking his mind to get information out of Tessa, we had to make sure his pack was well protected. Maddox had gone and back trying to change his mind. I'd known from the moment Zeke sauntered out of Tessa's prison cell that there was nothing short of a miracle that could keep him from going through with this. Tristan and Giovanni were working harder than ever to integrate more vampires into the safe haven. As it turns out, things were growing more precarious for the vampires that had yet to pick a side. The witches were closing in on one side, and the vampires still aligned to my father were closing from the other. It was becoming dangerous to be a vampire with no monarch to pledge your allegiance to, prompting a lot of them to seek out the safe haven. According to some, there were whispers all across the country of a growing town that was safe for vampires, regardless of their pasts. It was uplifting to know that the word was spreading, and that more and more vampires were becoming open to the idea of coexisting with werewolves. Both Tristan and Giovanni's families were making their way across the country to meet the new vampire monarch and to scope out the safe haven. It worked out perfectly considering I was planning a trip there anyway to finally attempt some sort of protective spell over the land. I'd been binging on blood and high-protein foods to get my energy levels up and was actually feeling pretty positive about the whole thing. We had made it almost 3 solid days without an incident when naturally, everything went to shit. It started when Brandon's voice slid into mine and Maddox's head. He had surprised everyone when he single-handedly stepped up and joined the groups of warriors sent to protect the safe haven. For as long as I lived, however long that might be, I'd never forget the look of bewilderment on Maddox's face when his brother asked to take lead. Witches launched another attack. His voice faded in and out. There's more this time, and the fire is leading them. Send back up and be fast about it. Maddox and I locked eyes with one another, the same thought running through our heads. The witches chose to attack in the middle of the day, rendering the vampires there all but defenseless. We already knew that if Ember was truly leading the team of witches, it was nothing more than a ploy to get her sister back. It was likely that the attack was meant to be a distraction. We'd send all of our troops to the safe haven hoping to end the fight before it begun, while another team of witches slipped past the pack's boundary line and reclaimed Tessa from her cells. Depending on who their spy was and how close they were to Maddox and I, there was a chance the witches already knew where the prison cells were and how to get to them. On one hand, we couldn't play into their plan, and on the other, we couldn't leave the vampires defenseless. Together, Maddox and I made the decision to send another 200 warriors to the safe haven, hoping it would be enough and that they would get there in time. Every other warrior in the pack was given assignments to move further inward, towards the capital where and I called home. Not only were our boundaries protected, but we had a dozen extra warriors inside the facility where Tessa was being held. Zeke had surprised us both by insisting on joining them. While Mason, Clara, and Sean helped fend off the witches at the safe haven, the rest of us remained at the pack waiting, holding our breath and wishing for the best. We knew the witches were going to attempt to rescue Tessa, we had predicted it long before they actually reached the borders. What we hadn't anticipated was how boldly they would slice through our borders. The entire town was vacant, the families pushing further inward to steer clear of the fight. The only ones that remained in this part of town were Holly, Tristan, and Giovanni. Even though the two vamps swore to protect my sister at all costs, I couldn't help but call to check in on them. Tristan answered on the first ring, skipping all pleasantries when he grunted, "Any update?" "Not yet, but they're coming. I can sense it." "I think we all can, actually." I shuddered. "Just calling to see how Holly is doing." "She's doing well enough. She just woke up from a nightmare." I frowned. "This is the first one she's had in a while, isn't it? Did she tell you what it was about?" "It is, and she did, but it's not much to go on. All she said was that she kept seeing dead animals and she knew that something horrible had happened." He replied. There was a commotion in the background that made him snarl. "If you hear anything from Brianna, do let me know. Giovanni is a weepy, bleary wreck without her." Giovanni's protest was cut short when Tristan ended the call. Where we stood, papers scattered across the roads, pushed by an invisible breeze that was cold to the touch. Silence took the place of all the townspeople, but it was fleeting. Maddox and I were among the many faces stationed outside the prison. There had been a split second where we all looked at one another, each one of us feeling the air shift as our instincts told us that something wasn't just coming, it was already here. "Alpha, they're coming in from the west," Beta Blake shouted over Mindlink mere seconds before the surrounding forest began to tremble and a stream of witches poured through. Their cloaks of deep crimson billowed behind them. They melted into one another, forming a sea of blood that was both beautiful and horrifying. Men and women shifted into wolves, thrusting themselves into the sea with fang and claws bared. They were swallowed by the waves, devoured by the crimson that continued to grow and grow and grow. Magic careened through the air in the form of heat waves that melted fur, or orbs of electricity that made anything they touched crackle and smolder. One witch with wild, Curly hair and eyes of steel cupped her hands around her mouth and let out a shriek that sent the nearest werewolves flying through the air. Another raised her hands above her head, drawing boulders from the forest to hurl in every direction. Maddox and I locked eyes, a wave of understanding passing between the two of us. "We don't let them get her. No matter the cost," he said. "Agreed." I nodded, steeling my nerves with a deep breath. There was no getting used to battle, or the death that followed, but Maddox's presence made me feel blissfully grounded. He stood tall and proud, not a hint of fear on his face. In fact, he seemed so confident in our victory that it filled the others like a drug. Even in the middle of death and destruction, I'd never felt safer than when he was by my side. A smirk tickled the corner of my lips as I said, "I love you, Alpha." Maddox's eyes, which were almost iole gold from his wolf breaching the surface, twinkled playfully. "I love you too, Luna," he said, exploding in a mass of fur the same bottomless color as the shadows. I was so unfathomably tired of death. The Pale Rider and I knew each other intimately. We were partners in a dance I no longer remembered the movements for, one I wished would end already but knew never would. There were so many fallen wolves. So many families to contact, so many devastating blows to land. Just as many, if not more, witches littered the ground. They had friends, I'm sure. Families that would wonder where they were or if they were ever coming back. They would be mourned by someone, somewhere. It had taken me months to no longer have nightmares of my father's severed head tumbling from his shoulders, rolling across the ground in a sea of blood. Every time I escaped the pull of a nightmare, a new one sprouted in its place, brought on by all of the death and carnage. Even now, after all these months, I couldn't even look at grass without seeing flashes of it covered in blood. I kept to Maddox's side, shifting between human and wolf as I killed in both forms. Each life I took broke something inside of me that could never be fixed. Maddox was horrifically elegant in his wolf form, slashing throats and sinking his teeth into anything that wielded magic. He knew the dance moves, knew death much longer than I had. There were rare beings in this world born and bred to send people to the other side. Maddox was one of these beings. The more killed and slaughtered, the faster I realized that I was not. So, I piggybacked off his strength and ferocity, letting his one-track mind smother my feelings of regret and doubt. We searched through the sea of crimson high and low looking for Ember, but she wasn't here. I used my magic sparingly, diffusing some of the more powerful witches before they had a chance to kill any more of our warriors. I'd just slashed through a miniature tornado when I hesitated. The witch that had conjured it was a child, barely a preteen. Her face was round, her cheeks plump and flushed with blood. The rise and fall of her chest were heavy, spattered with blood that could have easily been hers or someone else's. Seeing my hesitation, she blinked in surprise. Her lips opened to form a small O, and her fingers twitched like she wasn't sure what to do next. Staring at her through Maya's eyes, all I could think was that she wasn't supposed to be here, fighting on a battlefield against trained warriors. She should be starting high school, frantic and on the verge of tears as she tried again and again to pick the perfect outfit for her first day. Worried about crappy boyfriends and finding a best friend to spill all her secrets to. I couldn't kill her, and my hesitation almost cost me. All of the innocence drained from her face as she twisted it into a sneer. Maddox's voice bellowed through the mind link just in time. "Lola, watch out!" I rolled to the left, partially thrown by Maddox as he barreled into the witch creeping up behind me, a curved blade in her upraised hand. Before I could cry out or tell them to stop, a wolf with wheat-colored fur tackled the young witch and crushed her neck in its maw. The warrior dropped the dying girl and was on to the next witch, going through the same motions as everyone else. What was that, Lola? Maddox panted, letting out a huff of hot air from his snout. You would have died if I hadn't warned you in time. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. The girl was laying there, gurgling as she choked on her own blood. Within seconds the light faded from her eyes, and the future she deserved was ripped out from beneath her feet. Look at her, Maddox, I whispered. She's a child. Maddox turned his massive head and stared the girl down, his tail twitching as he saw the truth for himself. Despite his strength, he had a heart just like anyone else, and I could feel it ache for the girl. It was his nature as an alpha that led him to straighten his spine and hold his head high. Yes, she is a child, he replied softly. A child trained to kill. I'm tired of killing. I closed my eyes, hearing nothing but the carnage that surrounded us. Maddox's tail curled against mine, and I had no choice but to face him when he brushed his snout along my neck. His voice circled my head, full of such warmth and understanding that I wanted to cry. Then stop it. You have the power, Lola. Use it. Some part of me must have been waiting for permission, or perhaps support, because the moment I had Maddox's approval, magic crackled and filled my cells with power. I wanted the killing to stop, and I knew just how to end it. Tessa came to mind, and I used the image of her locked away in a cell as inspiration for what came next. The ground exploded, sending clumps of dirt and stone scattering in all directions. It stung as it pelted my face and arms, but the clothes I kept as I shifted into my human form protected the rest of my body. Roots propelled upwards from the ground, twisting as they climbed higher and higher above our heads. Each one moved on my command, an extension of my body that reminded me of having over a dozen extra limbs. I swung my arms to the left, and the number I wanted to follow obeyed. The rest I sent to the right, pinpointing exactly who I wanted to snare. Left and right witches were lifted into the sky, their arms pinned to their torsos as the roots wrapped around them, securing each one tightly. I lowered my arms, dragging the ones I'd captured down to the ground where they remained pinned in place. Witches scrambled to escape the roots I commanded left and right. I began to tire so quickly that I had to bite my tongue to keep from crying out when they began retreating. Blood coated my teeth from where I'd pierced my tongue, but I held on until the witches were driven back into the forest, chased far away from the pack's boundary line. The moment the last one vanished into the forest, the town erupted in an orchestra of deafening howls. Snouts were turned towards the sky and victories were bellowed in the only song we knew how to sing. When the howling had finally ceased and silence took over, I felt a hand touch my shoulder. Swaying on 2 feet, I peered up at Maddox, losing myself in the proud smile that graced his face. You did it, he said, his voice oozing with warmth. I scanned the witches I managed to capture. There had been a few that managed to escape with the help of the others, but it didn't matter. The point of this was to end the fight, to stop the senseless killing. We had 6 witches that would now occupy the prison cells. They had information, I was sure of it, but I couldn't justify torturing it out of them. I thought using my magic was supposed to get easier. I grumbled. It feels like it's getting harder. You've been using it a lot lately. Maddox frowned. I'm going to have to keep using it. I've got a town of vampires to protect, remember? I chuckled weakly. Tell Cordelia we're going to need more hemlock, lots of it. Even though my body felt like it weighed a ton, there was still work to do. Once the hemlock was delivered, we administered doses to the witches and brought them to their own holding cells in different parts of the underground prison. The witches hadn't even made it inside the building, which would have been comforting if we knew that was all their numbers. No way would they send every last one of them to rescue another witch, even if she was an elemental. When we went down to the level that housed Tessa's cell, we found a few warriors still lingering in the halls. Maddox dispatched them and gave them orders to watch over the other witches, and one by one they scattered. Before we even opened the door to the observation room, I could hear Zeke's voice inside. "The witches retreated," was all he said. Tessa's voice came out as a whisper. "How many are dead?" This question, Maddox answered. He walked briskly, wrenching open the cell door and glowering down at Tessa with an intensity that made her flinch. "How many are dead? Are you referring to the witches I have to burn or the werewolves whose families I have to return them to?" he asked coldly. Even Zeke knew not to intervene, and stepped off to the side to watch Tessa, his expression utterly blank. "Those witches have family too, you know," Tessa replied bitterly. Maddox's laugh was dry and brittle. "That's comforting considering some of those witches were children. I don't know about you or your blood witch, but I would never send children to fight my battles," he snarled. The sheer venom in his voice made the hairs along my arms lift. A hot wave of pride rolled through me because this vicious, ruthless alpha was mine. "We don't have the luxury of picking and choosing who fights for us," Tessa spat. "My people have been hunted for centuries by the humans and not a single vampire or werewolf stepped in to help. So, because the vampires and werewolves of the past failed your people, that gives you a right to kill them all." Zeke scoffed, then shook his head. He stared at Tessa with such disappointment my heart spasmed. "What did I do to get paired with someone like you?" Without another word or glance in her direction, Zeke left. "My numbers are not infinite by any means, but I stand by my word. No child on my lands, vampire or werewolf, will ever step foot on a battleground," Maddox said coolly. "I noticed your sister wasn't with the others. That means she was most likely attacking the safe haven. Care to explain why she wasn't here to rescue you herself?" Tessa pursed her lips. "Ember's power makes her valuable. She'd do anything to rescue me, but she can't risk herself getting captured in the process." Maddox crouched down low so that he and Tessa were face to face. "Your leader places value on people based on what they can do for her and how well they serve her. It's why she'll fail in the end. There isn't a single man, woman, or child on my lands that I wouldn't risk my life for, because all life is valuable. Even yours, no matter how badly you choose to waste it." We left that day for the safe haven, not bothering to pack or say goodbye to our families. It didn't matter that I was on the verge of passing out, not when the place we promised would remain safe had been attacked. There was no more time to wait. I needed to use my magic to protect them, and I needed to do it now. Maddox gave me enough of his blood to keep me standing upright. The only pit stop we made before peeling out of town was to pick up Tristan and Giovanni. Now that the sun was finally setting, they could safely leave the house. I cried out with relief when Giovanni passed 2 blood bags into my hands and quickly tore into them. It wasn't nearly enough, but it would have to be. We were just under a mile away and already I could tell something had happened. Smoke lingered in the air, crisp and heavy like someone had started a very large bonfire. Even coasting down the main road, the gouges in the forest were visible. Trees were knocked down and bushes trampled into the dirt. It looked like a pack of very large beasts had charged through at full force. I wasn't at all prepared for what I saw when we arrived. There wasn't a single part of me that thought the safe haven would survive an attack without any damage, but beyond all reasonable belief, I had clung to the hope that the damage would be minimal. We rolled down the main road intersecting the town slowly, giving me plenty of time to scour every single shred of damage the witches had done. From the number of houses that had scorch marks licking up the sides, it was clear Ember had been here. So many of them were crumbling, halfway torn down with families hiding inside, clinging to the shadows as the last hints of sunlight faded. It grew worse as we neared the center, so much worse. Bodies were lined in neat rows, covered in white sheets stained gray with ash. There weren't many, perhaps only a dozen, but it didn't matter. Those 12 carried the same weight as 100 as 1,000 would. The sidewalks and street were streaked with black marks, kissed by embers flame as she pillaged the town. Cars were turned over, some halfway crumpled and smoking. The stench of burnt motor oil hung in the air, mixing with the scent of death. Tristan cursed, and Giovanni made a sound of agreement. My mother and father are here. I craned my head to stare at him in the back seat. If we weren't surrounded by so much carnage and death, I might have laughed at how absurd he looked crammed in the back seat with Giovanni. Is that a bad thing? I asked. Giovanni snorted. If you think Tristan is unpleasant, wait until you meet his mother. I glanced at Tristan, waiting for him to snap or explode on Giovanni, but instead he actually nodded in agreement. There was nothing to say that would ease their discomfort. In truth, I wasn't too worried about Tristan's family or what opinions his mother would have. Seeing what happened here with my own eyes, it outweighed everything else. Maddox's hand grazed my own, his fingers sliding in between mine. I glanced away from the carnage and into his eyes, not realizing how close I was to plummeting until I felt his presence glide down the mate bond and into my troubled mind. It doesn't matter how many times they destroy this place. We will rebuild. He promised, his eyes severe and set in stone. More than anything, I wanted it to be enough, but it wasn't. I stepped out of the car, barely noticing it had come to a stop. The slam of car doors was quiet in comparison to everything else, drowned out by the weight of the stairs falling on our faces. A flash of brown curls flitted past as Brianna launched herself into Giovanni's arms. She tangled her fingers in his hair and let out her sigh of relief into his neck. Deacon, Dina, and Spence were the next to approach. I imagine we all had the same expression on our faces, grim without the barest hint of victory. More and more vampires were traversing the cluttered streets to the center of the safe haven, to the community center that served as a sort of town hall. Children clutching ash-stained stuffed animals padded behind their mothers and fathers, hiding behind legs and torsos as they scanned their surroundings with frightened eyes. This is the safe haven we've heard so much about. A refined and almost nasal voice chimed. Deacon's eyebrows lifted as he turned. Dina and Spence locked eyes, something private passing between the two of them. Tristan made a sound low in his throat, his icy eyes darkening. Mother, he said as a warning and not a greeting. I hadn't even noticed her standing there, the woman with soft blonde hair and an upturned nose. She had a delicate pearl necklace around her slender throat, one that matched perfectly with her powder blue dress and black pumps. There wasn't a single curl on her head that was out of place. Clearly she'd gotten here long after the fight had ended. Her eyes swiveled to my face, recognition and disdain melting into one festering pool that I did not have the energy to deal with. So, you're our new monarch. Lola, isn't it? She purred, the obliviousness in her voice as flimsy as her smile. I barely spared her a glance. Deacon cleared his throat. Considering you're on her land, why don't you show some god respect and call her by her title? Upon hearing his threatening baritone, I tuned out everything else. Tristan's mother's reply was shrill and fell on deaf ears. One after another, emotions impaled me in the chest. The longer I assessed the damages, the more I realized how long it would take to restore this place to what it had once been. Months of hard work reduced to rubble in the span of 2 hours. Honestly, you can't actually expect us to live here, Tristan. She scoffed, a delicate hand pressed against her bird chest. Her voice lowered to a whisper that wasn't nearly quiet enough to be an actual whisper. Think about your sister for God's sake. Do you expect her to live in a hovel? Don't. I told Maddox through mind link, feeling him stiffen behind me. Anything this woman said was meaningless, and empty words were not worth starting another fight. There was a little girl just a few feet away, clinging to the side of a man who had the same facial features as Tristan. His hair was much darker, but his deep-set eyes, angular nose, and pouty lips were identical. The little girl was the spitting image of Tristan's mother, only younger and not nearly as sour. She waved timidly when we locked eyes, and I did my best to muster up a friendly smile. Tristan's father said nothing, but judging how his eyes flitted from person to person, he was observing everything carefully. They clung to my face the most, and I wondered if he was naturally this curious or if he had a habit of gauging the emotions of the people around him. Enough, mother. They didn't have to invite you here, and you didn't have to come. It wasn't like this before. Tristan hissed. Tristan's eyes found my face for but a split second before darkening. His mother was either genuinely oblivious or had a talent for ignoring the things she found unimportant, because she didn't seem to notice the tension in the air or how all of it radiated from where I stood. All sound apart from her nasal whine faded into white noise, crackling in my ears like the vicious flames that had eaten through over half of the houses here. The rough asphalt beneath my feet vanished, as did Maddox's calloused hands on my shoulders. I was suspended in time, an observer to the damage and death the witches had caused, all with Tristan's mother bleeding in the background. She pursed her lips at her son. Not very safe, is it? What a pity. I was so hoping we could live here, but I won't risk your sister's life when it's clear this place is undergoing attacks every other day. She might not be concerned with us noble families, but I won't forego tradition. Mother. Tristan snarled, but he wasn't looking at her. Lucinda. The man I had assumed was Tristan's father approached. His hand was on his wife's shoulder, but he wasn't looking at her either. Lola, baby. You've got to calm down. The shadows are reacting to your stress. Maddox's voice trickled down the mind link, but it was faint, muffled by white noise like everything else. Night had quickly taken over, but now that I was paying more attention, it seemed darker than normal. Many of the street lights were destroyed, but even the few that remained did little to illuminate the ground below. The pinprick of a million little eyes hit my skin one by one. I turned around, and there they were. There were thousands of them, perhaps even more. Within every nook and cranny, crawling over every piece of this earth that the moonlight failed to reach, the shadows writhed. They crawled beneath smashed cars and into half-crumbled houses. A few brave ones slithered across the ground and circled around my feet, whispering sweet words of vengeance and blood. I apologize, Your Majesty. My wife has many talents, but holding her tongue is not one of them. Tristan's father said in a calm voice, one without the disdain and malice his wife's held. Lucinda, Tristan's mother, scowled at her husband. Lola and I have worked tirelessly on this place. No one cares about it more than we do. Seeing it like this is not easy for her. Maddox's voice dropped low, and anyone with ears could hear the warning in his voice. Lucinda glanced down at the shadows pooling around my feet with eyes of ice. Her lips twisted and puckered, deepening the fine lines that circled her mouth. Clearly. She said indignantly, then yelped and stumbled back when a few tendrils of shadow got too close for her liking. Honestly, your father couldn't control those things either. Disgusting, foul creatures. The tendons in my neck cracked as my head snapped in her direction. All at once, every mind-numbing emotion that burrowed into my flesh, turned to rage. What did you just say to me? I asked her, unaware that I'd stepped out of Maddox's embrace and towards the woman that dared compared me to that monster. There was a fleeting second where I wanted to show her exactly how much like my father I was. It bubbled so close to the surface that the thought was right there, hovering at the forefront of my mind, waiting for me to reach out with magic and breathe it to life. It was gone within a flash when I locked eyes with a little girl with curly blonde hair and pouty lips, Tristan's little sister. Leaning to the side to peer around her father's legs, she stared up at me with eyes identical to her mother and brothers. That little girl was the tidal wave that doused my fiery anger, but even the ocean itself couldn't tame the magic that lashed recklessly in my gut, frantic and desperate to be used. My skin was slick with sweat, my fingers twitching and insides crackling with energy. I'd been so close to turning it on Tristan's mother, so close that I wanted to be sick. The damage I could have done, the things I could have turned her into. It was all too horrifying to handle. Instead, I put that energy towards something else. The safe haven. I promised these people I'd protect them, and I failed. Each body lining the sidewalk was a testament to that failure, proof that I hadn't lived up to my word. Well, not this time. These people, the ones that called this place home, they would be safe. No one, not a soul who wished them harm would be able to step foot in this town. The moonlight that shone down on us grew brighter, as though it were becoming tangible. Waves of liquid silver, translucent and shimmering with magic, filled the air. Tristan's little sister stepped out from behind her father, giggling and stretching on her tiptoes with cupped hands to touch the magic I created. Vampires left and right halted in their tracks, heads turned upwards as they watched with open mouths. Mason, Clara, and Sean were among the many, their eyes tracking the glittering waves. Deacon reached out to touch one, inspecting his fingers after they had passed through. Up and up, they floated, covering the entire town like one big net. As each wave met the other, they sparked and sizzled before merging into one. It grew to form a dome, exactly like the one I'd pictured in my head. A vicious, tearing pain split through my chest, but I wasn't done yet. Through the exhaustion and the splotches of darkness clogging my vision, I grabbed hold of my magic and forced it to obey. I couldn't replace the lives lost, but I could fix what was destroyed. Gasps rang out, one after another until they all overlapped. The rubble littered across the streets, sidewalks, and front yards began to tremble. All at once, they flew into the air, circling one another. They formed a cyclone of debris and trash, comprised of shattered bits of drywall, chunks of asphalt, and sheets of metal torn from cars. Many vampires dove to get out of the way without realizing my magic had a mind of its own. It knew I wanted none of these people harmed, so it went the extra mile to ensure it. Broken glass skittered across the streets, attracted to their missing counterparts. They snapped together one by one, the cracks slowly vanishing until a fresh sheet of glass remained. It careened through the air, whirling towards a window frame that had been pieced together by chunks of splintered wood. Once rejoined, they coasted through the air towards the nearest house and snapped into place. Crumbs of asphalt met to fill in gaping cracks in the road, melting into one another to leave nothing behind. It was like this for every house, for every structure that the witches had destroyed. Like a reverse button had been pressed, the damage slowly undid itself. After several minutes the last brick of a chimney clicked into place, and once again, the town was whole. Deacon stared at me, his eyes so wide that I could pinpoint every fleck of grey within the shades of blue. "You fixed everything?" he said, amazed. "No, I didn't," I croaked, staring at the bodies covered in white sheets. "They're still dead. If it weren't for Maddox's hands on my waist supporting all of my weight, I would have cracked my skull on the pavement when my eyes rolled back, and the world went dark. I floated suspended in this blissful darkness for what felt like hours. Nothing could touch me here. Not the weight of exhaustion pulling me down or the agony squeezing at my muscles and bones. It was a reprieve, but one thing about reprieves is that they never last too long. At first, it started in small flashes. An explosion of light here and there, a flicker of pain, a whisper of voices just outside my mind's reach. Eventually, those flashes became longer and more drawn out. The light became blinding, tinted with colors and shapes that moved. Voices took form, names flashing in my memory as I began to recognize them. Each time I gathered the strength to open my eyes, it was sucked away by some intangible force. With each sensation that returned, my least favorite was my dry throat. I couldn't seem to keep my eyes open for long enough to drink anything, but what I wanted most was some blood. A few times I swore I saw the outline of Maddox's face, always hovering over me, silently protecting me from any and everything. When I gathered the strength to keep my eyes open for more than a few seconds, the first thing I latched onto was a feminine voice. Its high pitch and friendly tone struck my memory at its core and dredged up a familiar name. Cassidy. Maddox's voice was thrown into the mix, tight with unease that twisted my empty stomach into knots. It rumbled miserably, as if it knew I dared to think about it. "What's going on?" I asked, but my mouth was so dry it came out as a crusty groan. Maddox was at my side before I could blink, moving so fast it startled me, but I was too weak to react. His hands roamed my arms, shoulders, and finally, my face. Each caress of his calloused hands was unbearably soft, bringing on such gentle sparks that my eyelids fluttered, and the darkness reached out with loving hands to suck me back in. Thankfully, he pulled away before I could pass out again and promptly shoved something small and skinny into my mouth. Without knowing what it was, my throat worked to pull. When the taste of blood hit my tongue, rich and tangy, all thought was lost. I kept going until the winded straw sputtered and ran dry, but I wasn't nearly full. "What's going on?" I asked again. This time my words weren't garbled nonsense. Cassidy hovered nearby, her shoulders lax with relief. "What do you remember last?" Maddox asked, clasping our hands together. My heart began to flutter when he pressed my hand to his lips and waited for my response. A dull ache spread across my forehead as I followed the dwindling breadcrumbs in my memory that led me back to what happened before the darkness held me in its grasp. I remember going to the safe haven and meeting Tristan's mother. I sort of remember using magic to protect the land, but that's where things get hazy. I admitted. "You did, you protected everyone. There's now a force field over the entire safe haven, but you didn't stop there. You fixed all of the damage the witches had done. Every house, every car, the sidewalk, even the streets look brand new." He exhaled, shoulders stiff and rigid. There was amazement in his voice, but his expression was pinched. Those eyes of his I adored so much were shuttered with worry. "That doesn't explain why I'm now lying in bed back at home," I pointed out, lazily looking around our bedroom. "Wait a second. I passed out, didn't I?" Maddox lifted his head, nodding slowly. "You did. You've been out of it for 4 days now." My heart just about seized in my chest. 4 days. I had Cordelia and Rowena stop by. Neither one could do anything to wake you up, but Rowena was certain you passed out from overextending yourself. He grunted. I squeezed his hand, hoping to alleviate his grimace. When the crease in between his eyebrows smoothed out, I mustered up a watery smile. "I'm glad everyone is safe, but something else is going on, isn't it?" I took one glance at Cassidy, remembering the feverish way they spoke to one another before I managed to wake up fully. Maddox pursed his lips, but it was Cassidy that spoke first. "Your mate's just worried about his brother, even though there's no reason to be," she said lightly, an understanding smile curling at her glossed lips. Judging from the amount of sunlight streaming through the window and the perfectly creased workout clothes she had on, I assumed she was on her way to training when she stopped by. Her gym bag rested on the floor, the cord of her headphones hanging out the side pocket. "It's been 4 days since I've heard from him. He asks for a leadership position, then pulls this stunt. It doesn't make sense." Maddox muttered, "That crease returning. No one's heard from Brandon in 4 days." I frowned, my eyes darting between the two of them. Cassidy shook her head, her blonde ponytail swaying. "I told Maddox, already. Brandon stopped by to see if I wanted to go to some frat party days ago. He said he'd just gotten back from fighting the witches and wanted to kick back and have fun. He said something about near-death experiences and wanting to get drunk, but that's your brother." Obviously, I told him I wasn't interested. She snorted, then placed her hand on Maddox's shoulder. "Look, you know your brother. This isn't the first time he's gone off on a bender. You remember when he met that Cuban girl?" She cocked an eyebrow at Maddox, her lips tilting in a smirk that made me wonder exactly what Brandon had done all those years ago. Maddox didn't seem as amused but managed a slight nod. "Yeah, I remember," he replied. "Brandon went off on a week-long induced bender with this chick and didn't think to tell any of us where he was," she explained, flashing me the same amused look she'd given Maddox. "That does sound like something Brandon would do." I laughed lightly. Maddox frowned. "He called during that time though to check in and let Mom know he wasn't dead in a ditch somewhere." I matched his expression, my eyebrows inching closer together and lips falling. Brandon was a heathen at the best of times, but if there was one thing he cared about it was his parents, Claire especially. "He hasn't called this time?" I asked. "No, he hasn't even sent a text," Maddox replied. Cassidy planted her hands on her hips and shook her head at us. "He'd complain for the rest of his life if he could see the two of you worrying like a pair of mother hens." She giggled, softening her tone when she turned to Maddox. "Look, I know you've been under a huge deal of stress lately, but maybe you're being just a touch overprotective. You know how your brother is, and you know that sooner or later, he always comes crawling back. I'd say give him the rest of the week, and then we can start sending out search parties." "Yeah, you're probably right," Maddox grunted, pinching the bridge of his nose. The phantom throb of his headache rippled across the bond and made my eyebrows twitch. Cassidy hefted her gym bag and slung it over her shoulder, waving at the two of "Well, I've got to head out or I'll be late for training. Remember what I said though, Maddox. He's probably just partied too hard and lost his phone in the toilet again." She snorted, shaking her head like she was reliving a funny memory. "I'm glad you're finally awake, Lola. Training has been a bore without you, but I'll let Chris know you're doing all right. See you guys later." Maddox and I shouted our goodbyes as she left, but our eyes were on one another. The second the front door slammed shut, I was being lifted onto Maddox's lap, enveloped by his warmth and spicy scent. He let out a deep breath once I was settled against his chest, snaking his arms around my waist, and holding me there. When he buried his nose in my hair and inhaled sharply, I didn't fight it. "What do you think about this?" Maddox murmured against my head. I peered up at him through my lashes. "Are you talking about your brother or the witches?" "My brother." "Well," I paused, lost in thought. I think you should follow your gut. A big part of being alpha is relying on your intuition, right? It hasn't led you wrong yet. So, what's your gut telling you? After a few long seconds, he answered. It's telling me that something isn't right. Flecks of gold began to fill his eyes, swirling like they were suspended in oil and water. His lips flattened into a thin line, and when that crease on his forehead returned, I placed my fingers against it hoping it would disappear. When it didn't, my skin began to crawl with unease. Do you feel it? He asked, staring off into the distance, eyes trained towards our balcony doors. I didn't reply right away and instead tried to open myself to whatever it was he was feeling. The breeze wafting in through the balcony doors was warm, almost annoyingly so. It carried the sense of the outdoors, of the forest and soil. To anyone else, it would have been a beautiful day. There was unbridled sunlight streaming through the windows, beautiful if not for the tightness in my chest. It felt like when you held your breath for too long and your lungs began to burn, almost on the verge of exploding. Yeah, I feel it. I replied, squirming until Maddox loosened his hold enough for me to stare into his eyes. I have all of the warriors on high alert. Our pack and Zeke's are both on lockdown. The only ones going in or out are warriors. The feeling continued to grow, and fear quickly followed in its footsteps. There was no way I was going to sit here and stew in it. Not after spending the last 4 days unconscious. If it wasn't my growing determination that forced me onto my feet, then it was the fact that my stomach was woefully empty. Maddox kept his hands on my hips, hovering in case I toppled over. First, I'm going to raid the refrigerator. Then, I'm going to go and get some answers. Are you in? I asked him, holding out my hand. A grim smile curled at his lips as he placed his hand in my own. I'm in. After 3 bottles of water, 2 blood bags, and a sandwich, I was finally ready to get some answers. Maddox and I marched into the building that served as the pack's prison, which was now heavily guarded from the inside out, and went straight down to the bottom levels the witches were being housed in. During our trip down, Maddox explained where their interrogations had led them for each individual witch. Most of them are genuinely loyal to the Blood Witch, but there are a few that are following her out of fear. We haven't gotten anything useful out of them. Typically torture is the route we would take, but I didn't want to make that choice without your support. Maddox confessed, his jaw tense. On any other occasion, my mate would have no issue torturing a few souls to get information that might keep the people of this pack safe. Whether they were male or female, he'd have no issue doing what was necessary, but a few of those witches were barely older than pre-teens. Guilt wormed its way into my head. Was I doing the right thing? Was torturing these witches what really needed to be done? At the end of the day, I was one of them. The thought of torturing my own people felt wrong. Does it make me a bad Luna if I said I don't want them tortured? I asked him, lowering my voice as we passed a group of guards changing shifts. No, it doesn't. You have a duty to the witches just as much as you do the vampires and werewolves. Maddox replied. Before I could reply, a voice echoed down the hall. Well, if it isn't my favorite Luna. Zeke. I grinned, opening my arms. The smirking alpha pulled me in for a hug, making a show of plucking me off the ground. He swayed left and right, chuckling when my legs flailed from the movement. After a few seconds, Maddox cleared his throat. Zeke set me upright and tried to pat down my now messed up hair. I swatted his hands away, my heart leaping when an actual smile crossed his face. It wasn't as wide or as carefree as it had once been, but it was a start. I'm guessing you're here to see Tessa. Zeke deduced, only looking partially disgruntled. I did make note that he'd actually said her name. Lately, he'd been finding every reason not to. Sure are, I replied. Zeke shrugged. She's not going to tell you anything, but it's always worth a try. He led us to the observation room, and through the pane of glass I made out Tessa's curly brown hair. She was propped up on the cot, her back against the wall and her head reclined as she hummed under her breath. When her cell door swung open, allowing Maddox and I to step inside, her eyes snapped open. Zeke followed behind, and as her attention settled on him, I swore I saw a flash of regret cross her face. It was gone before I could truly take note of it, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined the entire thing. You've got visitors, Zeke drawled, crossing his arms, and leaning against the doorframe. Her eyes lingered on his for such an uncomfortably long time that I couldn't help but mind-link Maddox to ask what had happened while I was out of it. I have no clue. Zeke's been visiting her cells every day for the past 4 days. He replied. I know why you're here. Tessa sighed, her shoulders curving inward on themselves. It doesn't matter what I tell you. It's too late. You're too late. I knelt down to her level, forcing every shred of urgency into my voice. Tell us how to stop this, Tessa. Do you understand how many people are going to die? How many children? She chewed on her lower lip. You can't stop what's coming. None of you can. That's bullshit and you know it. I snarled softly. There's always a way. Not this time. She whispered, staring down at her hands. When she looked up, her eyes were watery. You can't stop what's coming, because it's already here. There was no amount of arguing, no amount of begging that would make Tessa change her mind. It didn't matter how many lingering stares she threw Zeke's way, or the number of times regret, or some other emotion flashed in her eyes. She wasn't budging, not in the slightest. Left with no choice, I did the next best thing. I called Rowena. She took one look at Tessa, and determination flooded her features, forcing her to press her ruby-red lips into a thin line. Midnight. Rowena said. We'll do the spell at midnight. Make sure you drink lots of blood before then. I stared at Tessa, giving her this one chance to come clean. She pulled her knees up to her chest and continued to look down at her hands, running her eyes over the faint lines along her palms. Zeke shook his head in disappointment and left her cell, not once looking back. Determination filled my voice and body as I turned back to Rowena and said, I'll be ready. Midnight, that was when Rowena would start the spell that would crack open Tessa's mind and unleash her innermost thoughts. There were risks involved, serious risks. For one, Zeke could go insane. His own subconscious shredded in an attempt to reach Tessa's. 2. What Tessa said earlier could be right. What if doing the spell doesn't matter? What if the witches are already here? We had all day to kill, and I was seriously not looking forward to it. Well, that was until Maddox said he had something planned for us, something we needed to do. You're not going to tell me where we're going, are you? I grumbled, my voice disgruntled even though my insides were twisting with excitement. Maddox's laugh was low and smooth, rumbling in his chest. It tickled the spot in between my shoulder blades, right where his body met my back. Thanks to the blindfold he tied around my face, all I could see was red, scraggly fabric. He'd put it on right after we stopped by his parents' house and made me keep it on the entire car ride. Even my nose seemed content on betraying me, because the only scents I picked up were that of the town and forest. Nope. Not even if you begged. He hummed thoughtfully. Actually, scratch that. I might just tell you if you beg. Never one to pass up an opportunity, I dug my heels into the dirt and jutted my lower lip out in a pout. Where are we going? Please tell me, Alpha. I half purred, half whined. Maddox's steps faltered, and the sudden loss of momentum made him press into my backside. I had to bite back a victorious laugh when I felt the imprint of his stiff CK against my lower back. Lola, I'd advise you not to do that. He grunted, his voice lower. Why, Alpha? What's going to happen to me? I feigned innocence, my voice silky and sweet. Maddox's heart rate jumped, and through the mate bond I could feel his desire spike, heating like coals on the verge of bursting into flame. I went to turn my head in his direction and felt the soft outline of his lips coast along my ear. His hands found my hips just as a shudder worked its way through me. I'm about 3 seconds away from bending you over the nearest tree stump and you until you can't walk. That's what's going to happen to you. Oh. The gravely notes of his voice trailed down my neck, licking and heating my flesh until I had to squeeze my legs shut to keep him from picking up on the arousal pooling low in my belly. This place you're taking us to. Is it better than you me over the nearest tree stump? I asked sweetly. Maddox groaned. For goddess's sake, Lola. Yes, it's better, but I'm not going to have much of a choice if you keep it up. To emphasize his point, he pulled my hips backwards, grinding the full length of his now fully erect CK against my backside. We continued walking in silence, but the urge to poke and prod at the beast was too strong. With every step we took and every crunch of gravel beneath our feet, it continued to grow. I'd long learned to keep my big mouth under wraps, but with Maddox I didn't have to try so hard. So, if you *k me over a tree stump until I can't walk, does that mean you'll carry me the rest of the way? Maddox groaned. Lola. I snickered softly but managed to behave the rest of the walk. There came a point where the heady crunch of gravel turned soft, much like soil. Every couple seconds the snap of a twig breaking beneath my feet could be heard, along with the rustle of foliage. Minutes ticked by when I began to hear the quiet whoosh of running water. Excitement bubbled in my stomach, bringing a smile to my face, but I tampered it down for the time being. Eventually it grew louder and was accompanied by the scent of fresh water and sunshine. Are you ready, Luna? Maddox chuckled, his hands on my waist to position and steady me. He didn't wait for an answer, and instead worked to untie the blindfold obscuring my vision. When it fluttered to the ground, I greedily took in my surroundings. With every new detail my heart began to flutter and take off. We were standing in front of one of the most beautiful gifts of nature I'd ever laid eyes on. A lake of pale water sat just 20 feet away, rippling from the little fish that swam to the surface. From the short distance its shape reminded me of a jellybean, but the lake itself paled in comparison to the waterfall nearby. Water cascaded down a jagged slope of interconnecting rocks, pouring down the ridges and grooves until it emptied into the lake. Running along the shore was a small man-made beach comprised of pale sand that glittered under the sunlight like diamonds. Hidden behind one of the small dunes was a woven blanket, one I recognized since it had come from our house. There was a quaint little picnic basket nestled right in the middle. Maddox, I trailed off, the words clinging to my tongue with reckless abandon. Sparks tickled the side of my neck when he rested his chin on my shoulder. He toyed with one of the straps to my bra and chuckled. This place bringing up any particular memories? He asked. When he slid the strap of my tank top down and planted long kisses along my shoulder, a memory floated to the surface in my mind. It felt like it happened so long ago, in a past life that belonged to some other version of myself. Truly, it had only been a year or so, but a lot has happened during that short amount of time. As I closed my eyes and allowed myself to be carried away by the memory, Maddox's tender kisses were replaced by the rough bite of tree bark as it pressed into my back. The world floated away, and we were no longer in Maddox's pack but in what used to be Tyler's. It was a different lake I ventured to, one smaller than this and not nearly as beautiful, but it was my own secret place I could come to unwind. I had made the mistake of wearing only a lacy bra and underwear, not knowing that Maddox was nearby and watching the entire thing. My eyes fluttered open when I remembered the way he towered over me, forcing me against the tree with his calloused hands, fighting the very fire that now licked at my skin. "Well," he purred. I swallowed, my eyes rolling when he scraped his teeth along my throat. The pain melted into something that felt too good, and that feeling sank lower, reaching the apex between my legs. Now I knew why he chose the bra and underwear I had on. It was all too similar to the set I'd worn that day. And no. I lied. Not ringing any bells. "Oh, that's a pity," he hummed, his hands snaking around my waist to pop the buttons on my jeans. "Perhaps I can help refresh your memory." The sting of bark against my back was nearly identical. What made this time different was that Maddox no longer had an iron grasp on himself and had long ago thrown his restraint to the wind. He wasted no time tearing the bra and panties from my body and lapping up every inch of my skin with his eyes. His stare was that of a madman memorizing every facet of what he was seeing, drinking in every curve and divot like he himself had molded them from nothing. He lifted me from the ground effortlessly, wrapping my legs around his waist and making a beeline for the blanket sprawled out along the beach. "This is what I wanted to do to you that day." His voice was hoarse, strained with need. So headstrong. Always teasing, always tempting. I barely felt the softness of the blanket as Maddox lowered me to the ground, pinning my thighs in place and sliding down the length of my naked body to rest in between my legs. Even after all this time, the way he stared at the most private parts of my body with such feral need, made my face flush viciously. Maddox stared up at me with eyes of molten gold, hovering so close to me that I could feel every hot breath that escaped his lips. "I'm going to eat you now, Lola." His voice came out impossibly low. "And you're going to scream my name and ride my face like your life depends on it. Understand?" "Why yes, Alpha." I stammered, my thighs quaking from anticipation alone. His eyes rolled into his head before closing, and a shudder worked its way down his spine. The guttural snarl that tore through him was my only warning before he latched onto the source of my slick heat. The unhinged way he moved his tongue, thrashing it against me, and reminded me of the night he broke into my room and forced himself on me. As angry as I'd been, as much as I'd fought, my body had never been so wound up. The memory assaulted me, merging with the present and forcing a long string of curses from my lips that ended in me mewling Maddox's name. When the stars faded from my eyes and the sun returned, peeking from behind a cluster of clouds, I looked down to see the glazed, filled eyes of my mate. "You," he growled, crawling up my body to force his lips against my own aragatus. There's nothing soft about the way his lips claim mine. They're all-consuming, a raging inferno that devours and destroys everything it touches. The way his hand rises to snare my throat, claiming everything, even the air I breathe, as his own. My body ached, throbbing with the desperate need to be filled, to be as close to our mate as humanly possible. "Maddox, you're killing me. I can't wait any longer," I whimpered, lifting my hips until the firmness of his CK rubbed against my opening, grinding into the little bundle of nerves that had me seeing stars. Please FK me." With one last resounding snarl, Maddox complied. The lake, the beach, even the gorgeous waterfall in the distance faded into nothingness. We could have been in a piss-poor tent in the middle of the woods, and it wouldn't have mattered. Every touch dragged me further into his depths, while every seductive word he whispered pulled me under, the currents so strong that I didn't bother to fight. I'd lost count of how many times I'd plummeted off the edge, but before long Maddox took the fall right by my side. We laid next to each other on the blanket, both of us sopping wet from wrapping up in the lake. He pushed himself into a sitting position and opened the picnic basket. Water dribbled from the longest parts of his hair down his sloped jawline, all the way down to his muscular chest. I followed a few droplets with my eyes as they traveled down the grooves of his abs, lost to the trimmed hair above his CK. If you keep looking at me like that, I'm going to flip you over you again, he said darkly, making me realize he wasn't rummaging through the basket like I'd thought. I wouldn't complain. I smirked. I'm sure you wouldn't, but then you wouldn't be able to drink these, he teased, pulling not one, but 2 blood bags from the basket. I gasped. You really did think of everything. Maddox looked in the basket a second time and frowned. Actually, I didn't think of everything. I must have left the water in the car. There's some sandwiches and bags of chips in there. Go ahead and eat, I'll be right back. Oh, okay. I shrugged. Pulling out the sandwiches and chips from the basket, I set them aside along with the blood bags he'd handed me. I wasn't going to start eating until he came back, but when I finished laying everything out, I had the distinct feeling there was someone behind me. The breeze shifted directions, sending Maddox's spicy scent billowing over my head. I thought you went back to the car, I said confused. Actually, I just remembered I had what I needed, he replied instantly. A whisper of nervousness vibrated down the bond, drawing my concern. I twisted around to look back at him, and what I saw made my mouth go dry. Maddox was right behind me, so close he could reach out and touch me if he wanted to, but it would have been hard to do considering he was currently down on one knee, a small velvet box in his open hand. Lola, his deep, gravely voice came out hoarse. I knew from the moment I first saw you, when you showed up late to your first day of training, that you were different than anyone I'd ever met. I'd spent my life surrounded by people that feared me or would bend over backwards to please me. None of it was genuine, and I hated every second of it. You refused to submit. You tested me, challenged me at every turn, and no matter how much I tried to hate you, I couldn't stop myself from falling. The world melted away again, leaving only Maddox and the little box in his hand. Even the heavy thud of my heart faded into the background, taking with it every frantic, harebrained thought that squealed in my head. Marriage wasn't something all werewolves did, but there were a few that indulged in the human tradition. I'd never truly thought about it, but seeing Maddox his soul and hearing him pledge his love, it was well worth it. He went to open the box, and as his fingers trembled, I sank my teeth into my lip to keep from crying out a resounding, yes. I was lost the second I laid eyes on the ring inside. The delicate band was made of tiny golden threads that wrapped around one another, all circling a gemstone the same warm amber as Maddox's eyes. It twinkled in the sunlight as though it were winking at me. This ring belonged to my mother and her mother before. Someday it'll be passed down to our daughter. I've already asked your father for his permission, so it's up to you now, Maddox said gently, his eyes so warm and unbearably soft as they scoured my face. Lola, I promise to stand by your side through every storm. There isn't a future for me without you in it, not in this life or the next. This pack, this world, is better with you in it, and I want nothing more than to be by your side, watching you do these incredible things. You're going to change everything, and my only hope is that I'll be there to see it myself. Will you do me the honor of marrying me? Will you be my wife? I didn't realize I was crying until Maddox reached out and gently swiped at my cheeks with his thumb. My lip trembled as I fought to speak. There was so much, so many things I wanted to say to this man, the one that claimed every piece of my imperfect heart and filled the cracks left behind by others. Every word swirled in my head, bubbling on the tip of my tongue, but only one managed to escape. Yes. With that one word, I was tackled to the sand. An unhinged laugh exploded from my mouth but was swallowed when Maddox's lips fell on my own. This time they were soft, moving slowly with the flow of our desire and melting into my own with a sweetness that left me feeling buzzed. Thank you, Lola. Maddox exhaled, his chest heaving, and lips swollen. Thank you for coming into my life. Nothing in my short life had ever felt as right as Maddox sliding that ring onto my finger. In that moment, there wasn't a witch alive that could touch us. We were riding the high of our love, and it was one I never wanted to come down from. We spent the next couple hours at the lake, flitting between swimming in the water, hiding beneath the waterfall, and lounging on the blanket. With each one we remained wrapped around one another, touching and tasting like it was our last day on this earth. Only when the sun began to set, turning the horizon into a watercolor painting of oranges and pinks, did we finally pack up and venture back to the car. Nothing changed when we made the short trip home. The moment we crossed the threshold into the foyer, we were a mess of limbs, lips, and teeth. There was a soreness between my legs that demanded more, begging for every shred of energy Maddox could give. We barely made it into the living room before clothes started being torn off, and that was only the first round. The second was in our bedroom with me perched on top of Maddox, my hands tangled in his hair. Lost in the moment, I went to nip at the mark I'd long ago left on his neck and accidentally bit too hard. A wave of rich, mouth-watering blood flowed into my mouth and exploded across my taste buds. Maddox's blood was easily the most intoxicating I'd ever tasted. It felt like my vampire side was sharing in the mate bond in the only way it could. His head fell back and as a long, unhinged moan left him, I knew he was lost. Can I? I panted, almost begging him for a taste. Yes, yes. He hissed. Take what you need from me, baby. I glided my tongue along the wound I'd made, latching my lips onto his supple skin, and pulling until his blood filled my mouth. With every swallow my head began to swim, inching me closer and closer to the edge until my back arched and I began to freefall. Maddox grunted, snarling his release into the hollow of my throat as his CK twitched and spilled its warmth into the deepest parts of my body. Rolling off of him, I sank into the bed. While mourning the loss of feeling so unfathomably full, I basked in the afterglow of an incredible OM and waited for the stars to fade from my eyes. Seconds passed in rapid succession, but my vision wasn't clearing. The euphoric haze vanished the second I pushed myself into a sitting position. I groaned as our bedroom began to tilt, perched on an axis that began to spin. There weren't stars in my eyes anymore, only chilling splotches of darkness that made it hard to see. Even my limbs were acting up, growing heavy and sluggish no matter how much energy I put into making them move. Maddox, I think something's wrong. I tried to speak, but my tongue felt impossibly thick, and the words came out a slurred mess. Panic began to take over and I quickly got to my feet. The floor seemed to shift, and I went tumbling backwards, but the pain barely registered. It quickly became too hard to keep myself upright and soon I fell back against the carpet, my head hitting the floor. I knew without questionable doubt that something had gone horribly wrong when my eyes settled on Maddox. Through cloudy vision, I could make out his face and eyes, both of which were entirely blank. They were void of emotion, staring down at me like he didn't even know who I was. Those haunting eyes followed me into the darkness that painted my vision and turned my entire world ice cold. I woke to the tang of blood in my mouth, and the stinging pain of something sharp prodding me in the ass. Ack! I hissed in pain. Turning onto my side, which wasn't any better, I felt around blindly for the perpetrator. My fingers froze when I registered the gritty substance covering the floor, the ground, I mean. It was dirt, scraggly and moist as it became compacted under my nails. Just about every muscle in my body ached like I'd ran a marathon. I tried to push past that pain, stretching out my senses until my eyes decided to cooperate. Cold lapped at my skin, grazing places that should have been covered by clothing but most definitely weren't. If I had to guess, I might have assumed I was outside somewhere, but that couldn't be possible. Other than the heavy pants of my breathing, there was nothing but silence. If I were outside, I should have been able to hear crickets chirping and leaves crunching beneath the feet of the smaller forest dwellers. There was none of that, not even the whoosh of wind passing through treetops. My fingers trailed over something long and hard, and I grunted as I finally found the object that had been jabbing me. "What? Is that a twig?" I grunted, smacking my lips as I struggled to speak. The tang of blood coating my tongue felt off. There was something abnormal about it, but I couldn't pinpoint it at the moment. It was a stick in my hand, I was sure of it. The surface was rough like bark, but damp as though the early morning mist had already passed through. Finally, I was able to crack my eyes open. The only source of light was the silver marble hovering in the sky, making it easy to adjust to my surroundings. My eyes latched onto the stick in my hand, only it wasn't a stick. I gasped, flinging the jagged femur bone into a patch of brush. Bits of flesh clung to my fingertips, picking up dirt as I scrambled onto all fours and whipped my head around. No, this can't be what she saw. They were everywhere, scattered in a perfect ring around where I'd woken up. Animals, dead animals. Their blood watered the earth, soaking it in a sea of crimson so severe that even the starving soil failed to soak it all up. The most sickening part, the part that twisted my stomach into knots and filled my mouth with the acrid taste of bile, was that most of them weren't even whole. Their corpses had been torn to shreds, limbs ripped from torsos and heads clawed from the rest of their bodies. There were pieces of deer, elk, foxes, even a couple of bears. Peeking out from in between flashes of crimson were the milky white shards of broken bones. Among the mix was the femur bone I threw. Even though it was right in front of me, my eyes struggled to grasp what I saw. The information simply wasn't registering, smothered by shock and the realization that the blood in my mouth wasn't human blood. It was animal blood, and from the taste, it had come from more than one. A stag's head sat just 5 feet away from my face, its milky eyes burning into me. Its stare felt accusatory, like it knew what I had done before I did. The sprawling network of its horns were coated in blood, matching the jagged piece of its spinal column that protruded from its shredded neck. I didn't begin shaking until a flash of red hit my peripheral and I dared to look down. What sent me into a panic wasn't that I was naked, but that I was covered in blood. My neck, all the way down to the pads of my feet, was coated in the flaky, drying substance. "Maddox!" I called out on instinct. "Maddox! You need to answer me, you need to answer me now." Again, I scrambled, but there was nowhere to go without stepping over the mutilated bits of animal corpses. Silence rang down the mate bond in loud, consuming waves. The words I shouted screamed down the bond were smothered by a wall of pure agony, of horror so strong that my body chose to revolt and spew every vile thing I'd eaten onto the forest floor. "Oh, goddess!" I cried out, staring at my blood-covered face in the pool of my own vomit. It reeked so bad, carrying the same ungodly stench as the decapitated animals. I knew the truth, and there was nothing I could do but accept it and let it smother me. I hadn't just killed these animals. I'd slaughtered them, and then, to make matters even worse, I'd eaten them. No matter how much I begged and pleaded, Maddox wasn't answering. My words weren't even getting across. I knew if I didn't do something soon, I'd be so inconsolable that I'd no longer be able to focus. I latched onto the next face that crossed my mind and cried out to them, praying they would answer. Be Brianna. Brianna, I need you. Seconds passed and I clasped my hands over my mouth to hold back another wave of vomit. Lola. Oh my goddess, where are you? My best friend's voice echoed in my mind, silencing my panic long enough for me to respond. I don't know. I don't know where I am. What happened? How did this happen? I was with Maddox, we were together. How did I end up out here? I stammered, trying so hard not to lose my shit. You need to let me through to you. Okay, Lola? I'll be able to tell where you are, and I'll use the shadows to come to you. It's going to be okay. It's all going to be okay. She chanted, but the edge in her voice gave me the feeling she was trying to convince us both. I nodded even though she wasn't here to see it. Okay. Bring some clothes with you, please. I whispered, shutting my eyes, and succumbing to the maelstrom inside of my head. It could have been minutes or even hours that passed before I felt the air cleave in two as my best friend appeared in her shadow beast form. Her paw slammed into the ground, kicking up tendrils of shadow that evaporated into thin air. The sound of flesh tearing in two was abrupt and made me flinch, but not a second later a pair of arms wrapped around my shoulders and helped bring me to my feet. Lola, Brianna whispered, her eyes wide as they darted around the ring of slaughtered animals. What happened? I don't know. I don't know. I can't remember. Goddess, why can't I remember? My voice cracked and Brianna yanked me forward into her arms. We're going to figure this out. It's going to be okay. You're going to be okay. She promised, but the waver in her voice told me she was just as shaken up. What's the last thing you remember? Maddox and we swam at this lake and had a picnic. Oh, Brianna. He proposed to me. I managed to hold back a sob but was powerless to the ragged gasp that clawed at my chest when I looked down at my left hand and saw it was bare. The ring, it's gone. I lost it, we'll find it, Lola. I'll scour this entire forest myself, but we will find it. She said fiercely, but I was far past listening. Again, I shouted down the mate bond only to be met with a wall of blistering pain that threw me out on my ass. Maddox, there's something wrong with him. I think he's dying, Brianna. I can't get to him. Oh, he's in so much pain. I cried out, clutching at my stomach and doubling over as absolute devastation tore me in half. Lola, listen to me. Brianna hardened her grip on my shoulders until I had no choice but to look her in the eye. Maddox is alive, but there's more important things you need to deal with right now. Do you understand? With every fiber of my being I wanted to grab her back and scream, what's more important than my mate? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I didn't, though, because staring into her eyes brought something to my attention, something I might have missed if she hadn't forced me to get myself together. Her eyes were bloodshot, the whites tainted pink from the thin veins crawling like earthworms. There were bags beneath her eyes from lack of sleep, but they were swollen in an angry shade of red. You've been crying. Brianna, Why were you crying? I whispered, my panic skyrocketing when grief clouded her eyes and drew tears of silver down her cheeks. You're scaring me, Brianna. Did something happen to Maddox? What happened? Tell me. Tell me, now. I didn't realize I was shaking her, or that I'd even put my hands on her to begin with. My vision was tunneling and all I could make out was her face, her tear-stained face so heavy with loss that I just knew, something awful had happened. Cordelia, she's dead, Lola. She was murdered. Brianna said softly, her lips quivering with each word. No, that can't be right. I gaped, a cold chill passing down my spine. Why do I feel like you have more to say? Did more happen? Lola, your grandma, and Sean, every word from that point on became a low buzz in my ears, melting into the white noise that flooded my senses to the point of overload. Disbelief wasn't a strong enough word to encompass the absolute denial shocking my system, frying my insides the way lightning crackled along the treetops, cooking the bark until it turned to white ash. She couldn't possibly be right. No, I wouldn't believe it. My best friend was lying. She had to be. It was all a blur up until the moment my feet hit the polished tile floors of the town's hospital. Brianna steadying me as I screamed, the air melting from between my fingers, replaced with shadow and night, was vacant from my memory. Room 232, a faceless woman in cheery, rainbow scrubs said to Brianna. I blinked and we were down the hall. The second time and a set of elevator doors were closing, a third and we were in another hall, approaching an open doorway where the sense of my friends and family poured from within. Every step we took was another chance to get a hold of myself, to control the ragged breaths that slid past my lips. It wouldn't have mattered. I wasn't sure even Maddox himself could put together the broken shards of my heart, not when I stepped into the room and saw her. The woman on the hospital bed, frail and much too thin, couldn't have been my grandma. This couldn't be the same woman that put her entire heart and soul into every pastry she baked to the point where she had the entire town hooked on her desserts. Grandma's face wasn't this lumpy, this misshapen, or speckled with black and blue splotches like deadly flowers blooming beneath the skin. This wasn't the woman who would spend all morning baking, dancing to a tune only she could hear while the cottage filled with the mouth-watering scent of cinnamon and baked apples. This had to be some kind of sick joke. I told myself this over and over again, but her scent, the scent I'd memorized over the long year I'd lived with her, said otherwise. The only solace, and the only thing keeping me together, was the steady beep from the heart rate monitor at her bedside. I scanned the room to find Brianna, but instead spotted Mason, Clara, and Holly. Clara was rubbing Mason's back in slow, soothing circles, her grief-stricken eyes on where Grandma laid in bed. Even the witch, who had somehow become a part of this pack, cared for Grandma. Mason's hazel eyes were bright with tears, the green specks so much brighter when he cried without abandon. His lips were moving, saying something, but I couldn't make out the words. Holly was rigid, carved from stone as her attention darted back and forth between Grandma and I, unable to settle on one thing. Chris appeared in the doorway, charging over to Grandma's bedside, his mouth moving but nothing emerged. I found Brianna standing off to the side, her hand against her lips to muffle the sobs that racked her chest. "Where is my dad?" I asked her. "He's downstairs," she whispered, her voice teetering on the edge of a sob. Identifying the body. Again, I blinked and was elsewhere, standing in a dimly lit hallway on the bottom floor of the hospital. The morgue. As the placards above the doors increased in number, I slowed my pace. For the life of me, I couldn't remember which room Brianna said to go to, but it didn't matter in the end. There were windows along the walls that allowed you to see inside, and that was how I found my dad. No one noticed when the door creaked open, and I stepped inside. Only Flora and the pathologist on duty registered my presence, but not my dad. No, his head was bowed, and his shoulders quaked with the weight of his grief as he cried over the lifeless body of his son. Sean. My annoying big brother, reduced to nothing more than a fleshy cadaver. The agony that encased me in its shroud of darkness was unlike anything I'd ever felt. Even Mom's death hadn't hit this hard, hadn't tore a hole through my chest so large that already I could feel it festering. I didn't want to look at him, at his pale skin, or at the massive gashes covering his body, but I couldn't look away. A voice in my head screeched, "This is your fault. This is your fault. Yours, nobody else's." I'm screaming so loudly I think my ears might burst, but no one seems to register the sound. It's then I realize the screaming is in my head, but that doesn't make it stop. If anything, it makes it grow louder. Only when I reached the table did my dad's head snap up. The sight of him, it made the hole in my chest wider, deeper than ever before. The man I'd always seen as a beacon of strength, a warrior even though his prime had long passed, was torn to absolute shreds. There was no strength in his glossy eyes, no ferocity on his tear-stained face. Only age lines, grief, and a longing for vengeance remained. "Dad," I tried to speak, tried so hard but it came out as a meek whisper. The vicious voice in my head snarled, "He knows it's your fault. He knows. You're not even his daughter. You killed his son, his only child. Killed him. Lola, your brother." Dad croaked, but the words faded as he let out a gut-wrenching sob, slamming his hand on the surface of the metal table hard enough to make Flora jump. Flora, the slender woman who preferred flowery sundresses and dancing to whimsical music, wrapped her dainty arms around my father and held the man who had slaughtered enemies, won wars, and lived to tell the tale. She held the man 5 times her size as he broke, doing all she could to piece him back together before watching him break again, and again. My fingers trembled as I reached out, aching to touch my big brother's skin and see for myself. The truth was right in front of my face, but I couldn't accept it not until I grazed his cheek and recoiled at the touch. He was so cold, his skin stiff. This was real. Sean was actually dead. "I know, Dad. I'm so sorry," I whispered, clenching my fists so hard that my muscles cramped and spasmed, but it kept the tears at bay. Just like Dad, if I started crying, I'd never stop. Suddenly, his head snapped up and his eyes found mine. "You have to find the witch that did this. Promise me you will, Lola," he said hoarsely. "Promise me you'll make them pay." Hearing my dad beg for justice shattered the last tendrils of restraint keeping me together. The darkness, the grim determination mixed with heady magic flooding my body was a response to his plea. It was as though all this time I'd only been waiting for his permission. "I will," I promised him, unable to say anything else. As I left, the same thought played in my head on repeat, slashing and carving away at the bleeding hole in my chest. Dad doesn't know. He doesn't know that it was Maddox. Maddox killed Sean. I went back to visit my grandma one last time before hunting down the witch that attacked them. There was no plan forming in my head, but one way or another I would find her and make her pay. The entire walk, Brianna's words back at the clearing replayed in my head. "Lola, your grandma, and Sean, they were attacked. I am so sorry, Lola. Sean didn't make it." "What do you mean Sean didn't make it? Who attacked them? You have to understand, Lola. I was the one that found them. I was looking for you, and when I stopped by your house and you weren't there, I figured I'd check Maddox's parents. Claire and Killian weren't home, and neither was your dad, but your grandma's car was still in the driveway. When I got there, the front door was wide open. Sean was all ready, and your grandma, she was on the floor. Before she lost consciousness she told me who killed Sean. Who was it, Brianna? Maddox, it was Maddox. Even now, after seeing his lifeless body for myself, I wished she'd been lying. When I entered the hospital room, nothing had changed. Well, except for one thing. Grandma was awake, her eyes open and scanning the room before finding me hovering in the doorway, pale as a ghost. Clara extracted herself from Mason and spoke softly. It took a great deal of my attention to understand the words she was saying. I don't think you heard me before, which is understandable, but I told you I was going to try a little magic to wake her up. I have some distant relatives that are decent with natural magic, so I figured I'd give it a try. I think I healed her a little bit, thank you, Clara. My throat was dry and with every word I fought tears, but I hoped she could pick up my sincerity. Now awake, I could see that the woman in the hospital bed was my grandma. She had the same long, flowing hair tinged with silver streaks and a face full of a lifetime of joy. That joy had been dimmed immensely, but this was still the woman I knew and loved. We're going to step outside and let you talk, Mason murmured, his eyes downcast. If you need anything, just let us know, Lola. I didn't fight him when he pulled me into his arms. His scent had always been calming, like a gentle wave crashing along the sandy shore of a beach. I breathed him in, all the while steadying myself and fighting back the tears that begged to be set free. Not now, I told them. There would be time to cry, but only after I found the witch responsible. Not trusting my voice, I replied with a nod. Holly stopped as she passed and leaned in to whisper in my ear. Tristan, Giovanni, and Zeke are out looking for Maddox. They won't let anything happen to him. She gave me a small, tentative smile at the end before following Mason and Clara out the door. Did you want me to? Brianna began to ask, but I cut her off. Stay. I croaked, my eyes still on Grandma. My best friend nodded and approached the bed at my side. The strength solidifying like slabs of granite in Grandma's eyes crumpled the moment I took her hand in my own. Never had she felt so thin and frail before, so close to death that my heart spasmed in my chest and thrashed as it tried to break free. I tried to save him, Lola. Her voice broke, and so did another piece of my heart. I closed my eyes, fighting the agony that fell like a torrential downpour. I know you did, Grandma. Her lip quivered, and Brianna stepped in to take her other hand. I watched him die. She whispered. I should have been there. I should have been the one to save him. I hissed through my clenched teeth, my jaw aching painfully, but it was the only way I'd leave this room without dissolving into tears. Her grip on my hand tightened, and I looked up to see her shaking her head. Sweat clung to the sides of her soft face, her hair plastered to the hollows of her cheeks. Brianna, tracking where my eyes lingered, reached out to brush the hair away. No, sweetheart. Do not blame yourself for this. Even heavy with grief, her voice held strength. It quickly became tainted with uncertainty as she continued. Lola, there's something I need to tell you. I know, Grandma. Please don't say it. I have to make sure you understand. I'm so sorry, Lola. Her voice cracked. Maddox killed your brother. It was another blow altogether hearing it from her, from the woman capable of so much love that she'd captured the hearts of all my friends, of everyone who had the pleasure of knowing her. I clutched my stomach, drowning in not only my own agony, but the agony I felt pulsating down the mate bond. My mate, my beautiful, horrible mate, knew what he had done, knew what he had taken from me. Listen to me and listen to me well. Grandma said, trying to sound stern, but it was hard to do considering her face was a mass of black and blue splotches. You know your mate better than anyone else. It might have been his body that did this, but it wasn't him. It wasn't Maddox. I looked into his eyes. Lola. You know what I saw? I saw nothing. No wolf, no man. Just emptiness, like he wasn't even there. I inhaled sharply. You're positive that's what you saw? Yes. She lifted her chin, wincing as she attempted to nod. That's not all, either. There was someone else there, a witch. I couldn't make out her features. The power was out, and she had a cloak over her head, but while Maddox attacked your brother she came for me. Grandma's eyes fluttered shut, a tear escaping her swollen lid to trail down a bruised cheek. I tried so hard, but I'm old and my body just isn't as strong as it was. Her eyes opened, and she looked down at her hands like they were a puzzle in need of solving. I've only been able to use my magic in my baking, but when the witch attacked me it exploded from my hands. I wounded her, Lola. Hit her square in the face, hard enough to make her scream. I'm betting you she has a mark or scar of some sort from it. Hearing my grandma's version of what happened, it tore open the wound in my chest until I could no longer tell where it began or where it ended. In order to breathe to survive, I needed to focus on something else. Anything else. I latched onto the vengeance in my dad's voice, onto the strength in my grandma's eyes, and onto the iciness of Sean's skin and the serene look that painted his face, as though he hadn't died a violent, painful death. I'm going to find her, Grandma, and I'm going to make her pay. I promised, letting her fingers slip through my own as I turned around and walked out the door. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.